So we're looking now at performance art. I'm also using the term body art, art where the body itself is foregrounded, the artist's body, as opposed to, say, the represented body. In minimalism, if you're looking at minimalist art, you're more aware of your body, the spectator's body. The phenomenology of viewing is foregrounded. But with performance art, it's tending to be the body of the artist as performer. So we'll blur those categories to look at other kinds of body art that perhaps is not really performance art. I'm putting the two things together. Another term that comes up in the early period, before people are talking so much about performance art, is the notion of happenings. That's a particular kind of performance where there's really a breakdown between audience and performer. A lot of performance art, actually, you don't see that kind of breakdown. There's still a distinction between who is performing and who is looking. To try to find some of the roots of performance art, well, one aspect is a broader category, maybe a concern with process in art. There's a lot of art where a time dimension comes back in. Like so much, it goes back to Jackson Pollock. You're very much aware when you look at his paintings of them having been made over time, because it's so legible how they were made from the final work, in the way that, say, a Titian painting, you can't necessarily work out how Titian made it, but Pollock painting, you pretty much know it's so clear how it was made. And also certain kind of interpretations of Pollock emphasize that, like Harold Rosenberg's idea of action painting, which I think is a slightly flawed idea, but it was very popular at a certain time to describe that kind of painting. They emphasize the process more than the final result, so that gets people thinking about process. I think that's the wrong way to look at a Pollock painting, that it is about the result too, but nevertheless it influenced other artists who produce work in following decades where it is about the process. It is the performative is what it is. There may not be an end result. So also the photos that were published of Pollock at work that also emphasize the process of making his images, and because it's such an unusual process compared to how most art was made up to that point in time, it comes to people's attention a lot. Well, the concern with the body, it's partly the body is somehow a resource for critique of Cartesian rationalism, a way of looking at the body as the site of desire. Desire is maybe a sort of positive force, something that could be subversive of established order. The body is a site of oppression, but also of resistance. Performance art, I think, of course, the issue comes up of the connection to the performing arts, dance and drama. Performance art tends not to share the conventions of the theatre, of a framing stage, of illusionism, of a very distinct gap between performers and audience. In theatre, the bodies aren't like real bodies. What happens if something happens to a body? It may be just completely faked. It's not necessarily real. So in that sense, maybe performance art is closer to things like the circus, or a bullfight, or some kind of daredevil feats or mountaineering, extreme sports, where there actually is some kind of real threat to the body involved. Performance art also tends to be a lot less verbally centered than mainstream theatre, and often no spoken word, no script at all, just more reference on the bodies. Of course, there are some trends within mainstream theatre and dance which go in the same direction, like Japanese Butai dance, which is much more physical, and there are other trends too towards more physical theatre. It's very rare with performance art to have a very strict script. There's a certain kind of open-endedness most of the time, or the result is a little bit unpredictable. Even if there's a plan to do a certain thing, you don't quite know how it will turn out. So that is very different from a scripted play that you act the same way every evening. Another difference is just the audience, you could say. It's made for in an art world context. That's the same thing of the difference between sound art and music. Sometimes the difference is hard to really to say what it is. It's just a question that, what sound art is made in a visual art context rather than in a music context. Perhaps the art form that performance art has most convergence with would be dance. There are certain tendencies in dance towards concern with everyday movements and things like that. In that time, kind of so-called postmodern dance. And some artists get involved with dance circles, like Rauschenberg, for example, even as a performer. Gets involved with dance. So looking at precursors in earlier eras, even going back earlier than the influence of someone like Pollock, we can go back to the Dada period. The Dada, this is what we're looking at the moment, Hugo Ball performance at the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich in 1916, during the time of the First World War, where Switzerland, as in the Second World War too, was a neutral territory. So you get emigres from all different cultures there, and it becomes a big Dada centre. And they had this Cabaret Voltaire, where you have this sort of nonsensical, deliberately provocative performances. He's reading a sound poem where the words have no meaning. Of course, he's got this costume as well. Oskar Schlemmer at the Bauhaus. We know him also as a painter, but also for his involvement with performing arts, producing very interesting costumes that almost, that really sort of change the way the dance is performed. So this is his Glass Dance, 1929. Actually, one of the Oskar Schlemmer pieces is going to be performed in the Hong Kong Arts Festival. That's a fairly rare opportunity to see such a performance. Or even Picasso produced costumes for Parade. Now, okay, that's an established ballet, but his intervention in it is kind of interesting because his costume is so extreme. It's going to control the kind of movements that the dancer can make. So all of these are possible precursors, really. Actually, before I talk about this piece, I want to talk about one that's not on your list, and that is the Untitled event from 1952 done at Black Mountain College in the US. So it's involving the composer John Cage and Robert Rauschenberg, as well as musical performers David Tudor, who's a long-time collaborator of John Cage. I don't have images of it, and I believe no images actually exist. I've never seen one, so I only know about it from written reminiscences of it. So various different things happened, and they all have different people doing different things in the same time at the same time without taking account of what each other is doing. So John Cage was reading from a Zen text, for instance. He was on a stepladder when he did that, and reading other things. Then he performed a composition with radio, playing with a radio. Rauschenberg played old records on a wind-up gramophone. David Tudor played a piano that had different things attached to the strings to change the sound. Then he began pouring water from one bucket to another and back. Merce Cunningham danced, and Rauschenberg also showed abstract slides. That's just pieces of glass with some gelatin in, with different kind of forms created. And at the end, coffee was served. The guests all discovered they had a cup underneath their seat, and they'd been seated in 4 triangles, creating these sort of diagonal aisles, which was used by a dancer during the performance. So everyone saw something slightly different. That was a really kind of foundational example of performance, and you see how it's using people with skills from pre-existing forms such as music and painting. Oh yeah, Rauschenberg's, some of his white paintings were shown. That's just bare white canvases with nothing on them, monochromes, which pick up shadows and so forth as people move in front of them. This, what we're looking at here is a still, just one photo from Alan Kaprow's 18 Happenings in 6 Parts from 1959, the Rubin Gallery in New York. He actually had been influenced by John Cage. He had attended some courses, a course in composition that John Cage had given at the New School for Social Research in New York. Actually, John Cage was probably more influential in the visual art world at that time than he was in the composing world. A lot of younger artists attended that course. So a moment of kind of blurring between different art forms, interdisciplinarity. So this is something we could call a happening, where there's a sort of breakdown to some extent between the role of the performer and the role of the audience. The audience is expected to take a kind of active part of some kind. The invitations already tell you that. The invitation said, you will become a part of the happenings. You will simultaneously experience them. So spontaneity as a key factor, loose scripting only. It was an environment with 3 different rooms. The audience could move from one room to another. Probably no one's going to be able to see everything that's taking place. Different things are happening at the same time, just like in that Cage event. There's no kind of overall scripted meaning that's easy to decipher. Musical instruments were played, painters painted on unprimed canvas, performers of different kinds moved around, read from placards and so forth, different things going on. So it's a unique event, something that can't really be reproduced. That seems to be part of the intention. Kaprow says a happening can't be reproduced. It is something that just happens on the ones. So a problem we have of evaluating these kind of things is that the documentation is pretty scarce. Unless in this case, I don't think there was any kind of film documentation made, so we just have a few of these images. But it's a sort of blurring between art and life. That's a kind of almost a utopian goal for art to have relevance to life, to escape its separate domain. One could argue art's separate domain is the very thing that enables it to have power, but that's not how people always felt things. Kaprow says the line between art and life should be kept as fluid and perhaps indistinct as possible. One of the things he's thinking about in all this is the work of Jackson Pollock, the sort of working method of Jackson Pollock. He wrote a very famous essay in 1958 called The Legacy of Jackson Pollock. How are we going to deal with that legacy? And his answer is through performance, through actions. His later works, just mention a couple. One is called Fluids, 1967. Ice blocks in different places in Los Angeles. And a team of people has to place them to create structures. And then, of course, over time they will melt away. But it's somehow the process of creating it rather than the structure seemed to be important. Another one using ice was a much simpler one, done in 1975, called Warm-Ups. Well, actually, that's more like a script that can be followed, so it could be done in later dates too. That's just two people take an ice cube and they hold it between their foreheads together until it melts. Apparently, it's kind of painful to do that one. And they speak to each other about what they're experiencing. Jim Dine, The Smiling Workman, 1960, Judson Church. This is in New York. It's a site where a lot of dance is also happening. The Judson Church is a deconsecrated church. Well, Dine is probably most well known for his pop-style paintings, but in this early period he was also involved with performance. The Smiling Workman. He adopts a kind of clown-like persona, and the activities he's engaged with is painting. So yeah, that's part of the reference back to Jackson Pollock, I think, this idea of that it's a performance about painting. It's about the wet paint itself. What you see in the bottom image, he's drinking from the bucket of paint. Of course, it's not actually paint, it's tomato juice representing paint. But so it's that kind of paint and the body. Pollock is pouring wet paint around, so he's actually drinking wet paint, or seems to be. Pour some over his head as well. He's making a painting, but I love what I'm doing. He's writing. He crashes through a painting and bodily involvement with the painting. It's like Pollock's physical involvement with his materials. So it's a little bit like Kaprow in wanting to find a way beyond Pollock into a performative art form. Yoko Ono Cut Piece, 1964. Well, it's been performed various times since then. Very simple idea, but then becomes more complicated in the actual execution. She is just sitting there or crouching there, and invites people to cut off her clothes using these scissors that are available. She's sat on stage. So again, there's this, direct involvement of the audience. There is a separation between performer and audience, but then the audience is invited to become active. The initial separation is sort of broken down, and the physical distance is broken down. The audience, there's a stage, but the audience can come onto the stage, and they snip items of her clothing off. And it's up to the performer to decide when the process has gone far enough and end it. It's slightly threatening, of course. There's a sharp object, and she's deliberately putting herself in a passive position. A little bit like Cindy Sherman acting out the passive role of women in films in her film stills. Somehow by acting the passive role, she kind of negates the passivity that is so often given to women in social situations, or to the extent to which the audience actions start to verge towards something violent or dominating, then that becomes something that everyone can see. It becomes part of the content of the work. It's somehow not a neutral thing, to invite people to cut your clothing off. It's not a kind of it's almost sort of primed towards being slightly more towards the violent side of things than it's kind of makes her into a kind of a passive object that will be dealt with in certain ways. So it's almost a provocation towards producing something slightly negative, A lot of her pieces are just little written instructions, like in her book Grapefruit, little instructions for activities, performances that you could engage in yourself, event scores, you could call them. And then they all have very loose possibilities of how you can interpret them. This is a common thing for artists associated with the Fluxus movement, like George Brecht, for example, had a piece called Drip Music, 1962, and it just says something like, an empty vessel should be placed beneath a source of dripping water. Well, that's very open-ended. You could interpret it in many different ways. Of course, every score leaves room for interpretation, but these scores are particularly open-ended. Kusama, most famous nowadays for her sort of dotted works, pumpkins and all kinds of different things. And indeed she started doing that quite early on, but also produced these performance works as well. So a slightly chaotic, challenging work from 1969, Grand Orgy to Awaken the Dead at MoMA. So it's in the sculpture garden of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And you can see the audience there. There's still some separation between audience and performers. The audience aren't doing any of the bold and possibly illegal or against the regulations activities that are taking place. I think it's an event that sort of got out of control of the museum in a way, deliberately sort of provocative, with naked bodies coming on display. Of course, the sculpture garden, as you can see, has naked bodies in the form of sculpture, and that's considered fine, but actual naked bodies start to become a testing of of what the museum is prepared to take. So it's really a fairly early example of a non-Western artist making some kind of a splash in the heart of the Western art world. One of the advantages of performance is that nobody knows quite what's going to come next. You can get away with things. That's why at a certain point in mainland China, performance art was basically banned, because you can't control it in the normal censorship patterns. Some artists associated with the Japanese Butai group, Kazuo Shigara, challenging mud of 1955. I think it's very clear how this sort of thing will link back to the art of Jackson Pollock. You know, he's a starting point for so many different things. Just as Pollock worked on the ground, so this artist is doing that, but with mud rather than with paint, and using his body directly, physically engaging with the material to push it around, whole body involvement to foregrounding the body. One thing that's very important for Butai, founded in 1954 by Jiro Yoshihara, is this thing of letting materials be themselves, not trying to kind of make the materials serve expression. So in the Butai Manifesto, this is kind of made clear. They say things like, "Let us take leave of these piles of counterfeit objects on the altars, in the palaces, in the salons and the antique shop. These objects are in disguise, and their materials, such as paint, pieces of cloth, metals, clay or marble, are loaded with false significance by human hand and by way of fraud, so that instead of just presenting their own material, they take on the appearance of something else. Under the cloak of an intellectual aim, the materials have been completely murdered and can no longer speak to us. Lock these corpses into their tombs. Butai art does not falsify the material, but brings it to life. Butai art does not change the material, but brings it to life. Butai art does not falsify the material. In Butai art, the human spirit and the material reach out their hands to each other, even though they are otherwise opposed to each other. The material is not absorbed by the spirit. The spirit does not force the material into submission. If one leaves the material as it is, presenting it just as material, then it starts to tell us something and speaks with a mighty voice." They actually mention Jackson Pollock in their manifesto as well, so that source is made clear. Again, working on the ground, I think so much is a kind of footnote to Pollock, it seems. Shozo Shimamoto, making a painting by throwing bottles of paint, 1956. Saburo Murakami, breaking through many paper screens, 1956. The paper screens, sort of represent like canvas surfaces or painting surfaces. So there's this funny thing that a lot of these early performance pieces are engaging with painting. It's kind of a step further beyond painting, most specifically, most of the time, Pollock's painting. Namjoon Paik, well, most famous as a video artist. We've met him in that capacity. But here doing performance, performing Lamonte Young's composition 1960 number 10 to Bob Morris, Zen for Head 1962. Lamonte Young is famous as a kind of avant-garde composer. So here we see a kind of overlap between the music world and the art world. So it's a visual artist performing a musical composition, but it's a very visual composition. The composition, it just was a very simple instruction: draw a straight line and follow it. That's the composition. So how he chose to interpret it was he dipped his head, his tie, and his hands in ink and tomato juice, and then created the mark directly with his body. It's almost like a sort of Zen-inspired ink painting. And certainly there are Chinese and Japanese precedents for using your body, your hair, say, to creating ink works, going back to the Tang Dynasty and so forth. Well, that's in the American context, but in the European context, an important figure is Yves Klein. He'd done things like, in 1958, exhibiting an empty gallery, The Void, at the Clerc Gallery in Paris. Just an empty white room. This is his anthropometries. 1960. Anthropometrics is the sort of measuring of the body. It's part of a 19th century attempt, for physical anthropology to tell the difference between races, supposedly, or it's kind of part of criminology, how to tell people apart, to tell who's a criminal and so forth. So the title kind of refers to that. But the actual performance is female bodies with paint on them and then moving them around to leave traces. So again, it's Jackson Pollock, and one kind of variation on what he's done, but making the body, in this case not the artist's body, but other bodies, more directly involved in the mark making. Sometimes the marks that are made look like impressions of bodies. They have a kind of iconic quality about it. Other times not. So, a lot of the work is done here on the ground, but there are also versions of this where they're shown displayed on a wall. You can see the audience is very passive. They're seated. There's this clear distinction: audience and performer, clothed, unclothed. They all look very sort of respectable, sitting there in their suits and ties. Musicians are playing a kind of monotone symphony, I seem to remember it. So more than one sense being involved, or more than one art form being involved. The artist is there directing the action, choreographing the action, somewhere between painting and dancing, you could say. So it's not his body, and so there's the slightly dodgy kind of gender breakdown of the male artist directing female bodies around. From our perspective, we might question that a little bit. Yves Klein says, they become living brushes. At my direction, the flesh itself applied the colour to the surface, and with perfect exactness. Well, Piero Manzoni has something a little bit similar. Again, it's the male artist in a naked female body, living sculpture, 1961. He's just signing a body, and that makes it a sculpture. So it's a reference back to Duchamp's ready-made gesture. Artist shit. Well, the idea you know an artist can sell anything, selling their own excrement, literally. So it's like it is taunting the art market and commodification in generally. Of course, it's body art. You know, it's the products of the body. It's all a kind of relic of the body, if you like. In a history of religion, relics, toenail clippings of the Buddha or something is a kind of a holy relic or whatever. But and artists are often sometimes treated as this sort of very special thing. The artist will be present at the opening of the exhibition. Wow, and then you might actually be in the presence of the artist. Somehow that's thought of as important. Janine Anthony. I used her before when we were looking at minimalism as one of the sort of feminist artists kind of deconstructing minimalism. Well, here she is sort of using performance in a similar way. Loving Care, 1992. So she's, using her hair as a paintbrush, performing the making of a kind of painting on the ground. Loving Care, that's the name of the kind of a black hair dye, I think. That maybe that's actually the material that she's using, a bucket of black hair dye which she's dipping her hair into. So it's a sort of a female material, material marketed to women to make, control their appearance in a certain way that they're supposed to, but she's misusing it, and she's also referencing, female drudgery of cleaning floors and housewife's task, those sort of things. And it sort of references back to Yves Klein and to his use of the female body. This is 1992. Nikita Sanfar, shoot paintings. Yeah, it's a performance, creating a painting by shooting at it, and then liquid paint that's sort of been buried beneath the surface is exposed and starts to drip down. Again, the drips is a sort of Pollock-like thing. And then the end resulting painting is an artwork in its own right. So there's a kind of object, plus there's the performance that produced it. Sometimes the thing that's left after the performance is just a photo documentation or something like that. It's a kind of complicated question. You often only know a performance through certain iconic photos of it that may misrepresent the whole story. Or even if you have a video of the whole of a performance, you're not going to get the same experience as if you saw the performance itself, because performances tend to be very open-ended. You don't know how it's going to turn out. It could turn out badly, actually, in some cases. Some are very daring performances. But if you're watching a video, then it must have turned out okay, or something. The sense of risk of a real-time event is already lost. So you're seeing a very different thing, and you're bodily much more distanced from it. Back to Joseph Beuys. How to explain pictures to a dead hare. So yeah, it's again, our performance is sort of tied back to a traditional art form. 2D pictures. He's in a gallery setting, and he's sort of talking about it to a dead hare. His face is covered with gold paint. It's interested in animals and their almost like the way shaman often have animals as their sort of totem figures, like he's very interested in bees. He uses honey as a material in his works. There's a series of lectures by Rudolf Steiner, as a German mystic. Actually, Kandinsky went to some of his lectures. I think Mondrian was interested in his writings. And he wrote some lectures about bees in which he interprets the activities of bees in a very mystical way, occult way. And I think that's one of the influences on what Beuys thinks about bees. Another one involving animal, in this case a living animal. I like America and America likes me, 1974. There's a sort of famous attempt to engage with America by a European artist. When he arrived at the airport, when he left the airport, he left it in an ambulance, so his feet sort of didn't touch ground on American soil. He was taken directly to the gallery, where he was sort of put in a sort of caged environment with a coyote, which is an animal that lives in the American continent. So it's again a sort of represents America in some sense, a totemic kind of animal. And at the end of the performance, then he just goes back to the airport in the ambulance again, so that there isn't this there isn't an engagement with anything about America other than the coyote, and then the audience can come in and have some engagement with him. This is in the René Bloch Gallery in New York for the opening of that gallery. So he was wrapped in felt when he arrived, one of his favorite materials, and he spent a week in that space introducing there were various objects there, like newspapers, that he could kind of use as props to. He had a kind of walking stick, and there's like a sort of shepherd's staff, it would be, and he had the Wall Street Journal delivered daily, and the animal sort of tore it up. A lot of the time they were sleeping, there's silence, they're watching each other. The audience is on the other side of a fence. So I suppose you want to take it as a kind of encounter between man and nature, civilization and the natural world. And of course, because it involves a living animal, it's inherently unscriptable. You can't tell what's going to happen. Beuys says, I wanted to concentrate only on the coyote. I wanted to isolate myself, insulate myself, see nothing of America other than the coyote, and exchange role with it. Actually, the coyote wasn't entirely a wild animal. For instance, I know it had a name. I can't remember right now what its name was, but it did have a name, which implies that it kind of had been around human beings for a while. And if you see the video that shows the a kind of larger excerpt of the event, including the moment of his arrival there. At the beginning, he feeds the coyote meat at the beginning. So actually, he's sort of establishing a kind of dog owner pet type relationship. It's actually not such a kind of raw encounter with a wild animal as perhaps it might seem. This is it's a new art form, performing art, but before I'm already arguing that it's sort of referring back to pre-existing art form, to the work of Jackson Pollock, for instance. But pretty soon, then you get reference back within the world of performance art itself. So this would be one example. Russian artist Oleg Kulik, I Bite America and America Bites Me, 1997, where he's sort of redoing Beuys' work where he is the wild animal. Taken from JFK to the New York airport to the gallery in an animal van and kept in a sort of pen in the gallery for 2 weeks with his wife as his keeper. Well, Bruce Nauman. Well, we've met him already for other aspects of his artistic production. But yeah, he's also involved with the beginnings of performance in America, walking in an exaggerated manner around the perimeter of a square, 1967 to 8. Very simple, everyday activity. Some dance at that time also starts to be concerned with everyday repetitive movements and how that might be something dance should respond to. Dennis Oppenheim, reading Position for a Second-Degree Burn, 1970. So here the photo documentation is kind of crucial, putting together a kind of before and after moment. Well, it's his own body he's using to create marks through process of sun tanning, just lying in the sun with a book and then removing the book. So it's a transformation to his own body, but a very, very simple and temporary one. Only the photo can really capture it. Or using his body almost like a thing within a sculptural installation, suspending himself between 2 masonry walls. This is Parallel Stress of 1970. He gradually widening the gap till he collapses. And then there's one down below which shows a similar kind of idea. His father I think I'm right in saying his father went to school at King's College, just down the road here. I think he had a Hong Kong connection. Chris Burden's Shooting Piece, 1971. Well, this is example, Dennis Oppenheim's Position for a Second Degree Burn. Well, of course, yes, he was risking some kind of burning and maybe skin cancer or something like that, but it's nothing like the risk of Chris Burden. So this is really pushing towards the extreme end of performance art and the difference between stage performance or film for that matter, where physical risk is really at a minimum. he asked a friend to shoot a gun at him at a fairly short distance. This is one of a whole number of performances he did with certain kind of extreme and slightly masochistic quality to them. It's only a sort of like a 15 feet distance away. He asked to be shot in the arm, and he was, and actually he was fairly badly hurt, but I think maybe more than was originally intended to be the case. He did another where he put himself in a bag, a canvas bag, in the middle of a busy street in LA. Police stopped it and arrested him. Another one, he was installed inside a locker, 2 foot by 3 foot locker for 5 days, with just water piped in from the locker above. Well, this is obviously very extreme, and some people say, "Oh, why should art do something like that?" But human beings do, in other contexts, explore extreme states. Like people question artists doing this, but they don't necessarily question sports people doing similarly extreme things. How many people have died trying to climb to the summit of Everest? Loads and loads of people die. Practically every year people die, but people don't say mountaineering should be stopped. This is crazy. It's sort of accepted that a degree of risk is acceptable. As I said earlier, you could liken it to circus, where certain performances have an actual risk involved, or daredevil feats. Trying Evel Knievel trying to jump over a bunch of buses or something like that. Whatever he did. Even in the realm of art, there's photojournalism, say war journalism. There's real risk involved there to get those photos. Sometimes you might want to say there is, in certain kind of religious practices, there's also physical danger and pain involved. Like in the Philippines, there are people who have themselves crucified to kind of get the feeling of what the crucifixion would have been. Not to the point of death, of course, but just nevertheless, it's very extreme. Or certain kind of shamanic rituals involve rather extreme states. Quite famous for this extremism would be Marina Abramovic. Maybe we should stop there. And I'll start with her next week.